How emergency banking became permanent policy. It was supposed to last days, maybe weeks, a temporary fix for an extraordinary moment, but some decisions never learned how to end. To understand why emergency banking became permanent, we need to return to a moment when survival mattered more than rules. In times of crisis, speed replaces debate. Decisions are made to stop collapse, not to design the future. Yet once stability returns, those decisions rarely disappear. They linger, quietly reshaping the system long after the panic fades. Today, emergency tools feel normal. Liquidity facilities guarantees, special lending programs. They activate almost automatically when stress appears. Markets expect them. Banks plan around them. What once shocked the public now barely makes headlines. The extraordinary has become routine. This pattern began when officials realized that hesitation was more dangerous than intervention. Each crisis reinforced the same lesson. Acting fast restored confidence. Acting late multiplied damage. Over time, the line between temporary response and permanent structure blurred. At first, emergency powers felt uncomfortable. They challenged long-standing beliefs about free markets and private risk. But every successful rescue strengthened the argument for keeping them ready. If a tool worked once, why not preserve it? If it prevented collapse, why ever give it up? Slowly, the system adapted. Banks adjusted behavior, knowing backstops existed. Policymakers refined mechanisms designed for speed, not restraint. The original context faded, but the infrastructure remained. What started as a reaction to fear began evolving into a standing framework. And with each passing decade, emergency banking stopped feeling like an exception. It became part of how the system functioned every day. As emergency tools became familiar, their presence reshaped expectations on all sides. Banks no longer viewed them as last resorts. They became assumptions. In planning meetings and risk models, the question was no longer if support would arrive, but how quickly it would appear. This shift changed incentives in subtle ways. Liquidity no longer had to be fully self-sustained. Short-term funding felt safer. Exposure to sudden stress seemed manageable. The knowledge that extraordinary help existed softened the consequences of aggressive strategies. Policymakers noticed a pattern, but faced a dilemma. Removing emergency tools risked renewed instability. Leaving them in place risked encouraging dependence. Every attempt to tighten rules collided with the memory of past collapses. Fear of repeating history overpowered the desire for restraint. Each new crisis added layers. Facilities designed for one event were repurposed for another. Eligibility widened. Timelines extended. What began as narrow interventions grew into flexible systems ready to adapt on demand. The architecture of emergency response became permanent, even if its activation remained conditional. Public perception evolved as well. When support arrived, it was no longer shocking. It was expected. Markets reacted not to whether intervention would happen, but to whether it was large enough. Silence from authorities caused more anxiety than bad news. This normalization carried an unintended message. If emergencies were always met with intervention, then perhaps they were no longer emergencies at all. They were features of a system designed to absorb shocks continuously, rather than prevent them entirely. Behind the scenes, the balance shifted. Emergency banking stopped being about restoring normalcy. It became a tool for managing an economy that never truly returned to calm. The deeper conflict emerged when emergency measures began influencing behavior before any crisis appeared. Banks planned as if support already existed. Markets priced assets with intervention in mind. Risk was no longer evaluated in isolation. It was evaluated with a safety net beneath it. This created a quiet feedback loop. The more emergency tools succeeded, the more essential they felt. The more essential they felt, the harder they were to remove. Stability became dependent on readiness, not resilience. The system was calm, but only as long as the mechanism stayed in place. Attempts to roll back these powers rarely lasted. Each effort collided with a new shock, a market disruption, a funding freeze, a sudden loss of confidence. Every time, emergency tools returned, often faster and broader than before. What was meant to be temporary became reflexive. Critics warned of moral hazard. If failure was cushioned, then caution would erode. Supporters countered that modern finance was too interconnected for purity. Allowing collapse would punish innocents faster than decision-makers. The argument never settled. It only paused between crises. Over time, the language changed. Extraordinary measures became macroprudential tools. Crisis responses were reframed as stability management. The system no longer aimed to eliminate emergencies. It aimed to survive them smoothly. This reframing altered how power flowed. Decisions once debated publicly moved into technical spaces. Timing, scale, and eligibility were adjusted quietly. Confidence was preserved, but transparency thinned. The public saw calm markets, not the machinery underneath. By the time anyone asked whether emergency banking could be undone, the answer was already clear. The system had grown around it. Removing it would cause more disruption than keeping it. Emergency policy had fused with everyday banking, whether anyone intended it or not. The moment emergency banking became permanent was not marked by legislation or speeches. It happened through repetition. Each crisis reinforced the same response, until the response itself defined stability. What once felt like extraordinary protection slowly became structural support. The system stopped asking how to function without intervention. It focused on how to deploy it faster, smoother, and with fewer visible disruptions. Calm markets became the metric of success. This transformation reshaped accountability. When outcomes depended on emergency tools, responsibility blurred. Success was shared. Failure was absorbed. The line between private decision and public consequence softened, then faded. Yet the system did deliver something undeniable. Fewer total collapses, faster recoveries, a sense of continuity even during stress. For many, that trade-off felt worth it. Stability mattered more than purity. Survival mattered more than theory. But permanence carries its own risk. When emergency tools are always ready, they stop signaling danger. They become expected, and expectations shape behavior as powerfully as fear once did. Today's banking system stands on that foundation, a structure built not just to operate, but to endure shocks without breaking. Whether that endurance represents strength or dependency depends on what comes next. What the permanence of emergency banking also reveals is something about the nature of institutional memory. Organizations do not remember the way individuals do. They remember through structure, through the tools they keep ready, through the procedures they rehearse, through the expectations embedded in their planning. When emergency tools become permanent, they become institutional memory made physical. They encode the lesson that crisis can arrive at any time, that readiness is more valuable than purity, that the cost of being unprepared exceeds the cost of being always prepared. That lesson is not wrong, but it changes what the system is optimized for. A system optimized for readiness is not the same as a system optimized for efficiency, or for fairness, or for the kind of healthy failure that teaches discipline and removes the weakest participants. Readiness requires buffer. Buffer requires cost. Cost requires someone to carry it. And the question of who carries it is where the seemingly technical debate about emergency tools becomes deeply political. Every dollar held in a liquidity buffer is a dollar not deployed elsewhere. Every guarantee extended to a large institution is a guarantee not available for smaller ones. Every facility kept running beyond its original mandate is a signal about who the system considers essential. These are not neutral choices. They are choices that, once made repeatedly, harden into assumptions. And assumptions, once hardened, are nearly impossible to debate because they no longer feel like choices. They feel like facts. Emergency banking became permanent policy not through conspiracy, but through the slow accumulation of individual rational decisions, each of which made sense in its moment, and all of which together produce a system that now cannot imagine being otherwise. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. That is the quiet achievement and the quiet warning, embedded in the same transformation. The system is more resilient than it has ever been, and more dependent on its own interventions than it has ever been. Those two facts are not contradictions. They are the same fact described from different angles. And which angle you stand at determines whether what you see looks like progress, or like fragility wearing the clothes of stability. Both perspectives are correct. Neither is complete without the other. How